Welcome back to No Apologies. Very happy and excited to have our next guest on. We are going to talk about something that's on everyone's mind. Scott Horton, director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, host of the Scott Horton Show podcast, author, I believe maybe most recent book, 2021's Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terror. Do I have that all right, Scott?
Yes, sir. That's right. Before that, I wrote Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. That was 4 years ago.
Wow.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, not enough people in power read your book in a timely fashion.
Got that right.
There's a real tragedy has unfolded, I think, for our nation. Something that, in my mind, is going to be, something that for many decades, if not generations, people are going to look back on and be able to point to as one of the greatest bungled foreign affairs in the history of the United States. Am I overstating it, do you think, Scott?
You mean the whole war or just the embarrassment of the withdrawal, the way it was handled there?
Well, I think the embarrassment is the culmination. I mean, you've got kind of the slow cooker war, which I believe was a mistake. But then the grand finale, to have bungled it and in the manner it was, I think, is just sort of the frosting on this really terrible cake.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's an article out today in Vanity Fair, of all places, that purports to tell the inside story at the State Department about how they had created a new agency inside the State Department that was responsible for rapid extraction of people around the world. And they were using this to great effect during COVID and all of that in the last year or so. And then because Mike Pompeo, and this is obviously liberal leaning Democratic people writing this in Vanity Fair, but since Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, championed this particular office, well, Tony Blinken came in and shut it all down, but he didn't replace it with anything effective. And so the State Department was essentially right in the middle of shooting themselves in the foot and shutting down their ability to evacuate their people right during the fall of Kabul. So,
Wow.
In other words, the withdrawal, just like the entire war, is a government program. And the thing is a complete disaster. It's no different than if you hired the Department of Health and Human Services to go and be in charge of extracting people at the end of a war. Or for that matter, as Harry Brown used to say about the U.S. Army, they're nothing but the post office with M16s. You send them over there to remake a wild foreign society in the middle of South Central Asia, and you think that could possibly work? I mean, think about it like this. What if any foreign nation, take your pick, came to America and propped up a new government over us and said, this is the natural government that represents the people of the United States. And those who fight against it, well, they're just all a bunch of foreign terrorists. And then how long could anyone with $1 trillion or $2 trillion or $20 trillion, how long could anyone put on that scam until finally local Americans with rifles succeeded in driving them back off of our shores where they belong? It's the same as if we tried this anywhere else, really. The only reason it worked in Japan and in Germany, which the hawks always cite, is because the Soviet Union was looming over their head. So their choice was either go with us or go with Stalin. So of course they went with us. And both of those had already previously been parliamentary democracies anyway, which is just, you're talking about doing that to Afghanistan? That'd be like the Afghans coming and trying to remake Texas or Colorado or North Dakota, take these lands from us. It'll never happen.
Yeah. That's a great way to frame it, because it's something that I think everyone can relate to when you put it in those terms. I mean, we have this sense when you hear the neocons or whomever speak, we need to bring freedom to these people. But really what we're doing is bringing our culture and our way of life. But if you flip it, it's silly. We wouldn't even consider it. Where do you put and I'm not sure that there's anything positive that comes of this question, Scott, but I'll ask it anyway. Where do you put the greatest blame? On Bush, that got us there and then didn't subsequently take us out? On Obama or Trump, that didn't get us out? Or with Biden, that got us out, but in a horrendous manner?
Yes, absolutely right.
Okay. I see what you're saying there.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously the lion's share of the responsibility is on George W. Bush here. They knew good and well, like the American people did not, but in the Bush government, they certainly knew good and well the difference between Al Qaeda and the Taliban. In fact, this is why so many people became 9/11 truthers, is because we were told the story that we were attacked by the Taliban, a bunch of hillbilly cavemen from the town of Bedrock on the far side of the planet, and they hate us because of how free we are. And it just doesn't make sense. So people thought, well, Dick Cheney must have done it so he could attack Iraq or something like that. But the reality was, it wasn't Afghans who attacked us at all. It was Egyptians and Saudis who were hiding in Afghanistan, and they were, the somewhat unwelcome guests of the Taliban regime at the time. But it just wasn't the same thing. And from the very beginning of the war, instead of going right where they knew bin Laden, at least where there was a very good chance he would be, at the Lion's Den hideout in Tora Bora in the White Mountains in Nangarhar province, which is where they lost him. But that's where ABC News and CNN had interviewed him in the past. Everybody knew that was his hideout there. And instead of dropping all the resources we had there, they sent them all to the north of the country to help the Northern Alliance fight their civil war against the Taliban. Why? Meanwhile, bin Laden got away. They didn't even begin to try to isolate him and capture him until the beginning of December, more than 6 weeks, 8 weeks into the war. And then they legendarily refused to give the Delta Force and the CIA, the Rangers, Green Berets, and Marines that they were desperately begging for reinforcements to come and seal the Pakistani border. And then, I know you've all heard this a million times, then bin Laden slipped across the border into Pakistan. I just read the new version of this in the New York Times yesterday. He melted across the border. What does that mean? It means they can't finish the sentence for you. They just want you to change the subject. They can't address the question of why the Delta Force was not allowed to follow bin Laden into Pakistan. It's not like he went to Russia, where obviously we can't send soldiers into Russia, can we? But this is Pakistan. This is a friendly nation, which was already at that point, at our feet, loyal to our goals, under absolute threat by the Bush administration to cooperate. And they were cooperating. So they could have easily sent Delta Force after him. And Bush, I believe, made the deliberate decision to let Osama bin Laden escape. So because they needed that Emmanuel Goldstein figure from George Orwell's 1984, the boogeyman, the permanent scary enemy out there who's out to get you. And first and foremost, because they wanted to go to Baghdad. And they had to spin this conspiracy theory to scare your mom, essentially, right? That Saddam Hussein could give his chemical weapons to Osama bin Laden. And then, but who cares about that if bin Laden's already dead? And the American people believe that justice has been done, the guilty have been punished, and the war is over. And that's what you get for messing with America. Now you're telling me a year and a half later, we have to start a whole other war against a country that didn't attack us? They needed him alive so they could pretend that he was still a threat to the American people out there. And this is the real tragedy of the whole thing. Well, one, terrible irony of the whole thing is that what bin Laden was trying to do was provoke us into invading Afghanistan. It's asymmetric war. It's a tiny little group of bandits, 400 little terrorist criminals hiding out in Nangarhar province, trying to take on the global superpower. Well, how do you do that? There's only one way to do that: to give our cynical, corrupt government an excuse, a crisis to exploit, so that they could accomplish their own agendas. And so, just as the Americans had helped to bait the Soviets into invading Afghanistan in the 1980s in order to give them their own Vietnam, to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy, with America's help, this is where Al Qaeda came from, was Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan helped them do this to the Soviets. And bin Laden just said, we're going to do the same thing to the Americans next. And that's exactly what we've been helping them do to us for the last 20 years.
Yep, I agree. I absolutely think we were duped. I've got some follow-up questions on what you've just said there. We're going to take a quick break here, and we will be right back with Scott Horton. Thank you. Welcome back. It's No Apologies, your after-hours oasis of sanity. We have a very special guest with us, Scott Horton from the Scott Horton Show podcast, also author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terror is a recent book. A book prior to that was Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Scott, you were just talking about these aspects, this sort of gamesmanship that goes on, and we don't have clear, thought out goals, at least not that we seem to actually be trying to accomplish. So when it comes to this, what is the motivation of, say, George W. Bush and others, neocons that want to go into Afghanistan? And, we hear things about poppy fields. We hear things about rare earth minerals. We have this hubris that of just like we're this, bastion of freedom, and we want to bring it to other nations. If what is it? What's the end game if it wasn't actually just to go in, boom, take out bin Laden, get out? What was the goal?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the overriding reason for the invasion was to get Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, who had attacked us. And they knew that it was bin Laden and his group that had attacked us because they knew the attack was coming all summer. And even though the CIA had been warning Bush, they say that their hair was on fire, that they were so upset and trying to get the Bush administration to pay attention. The neoconservatives that you mentioned there, especially at the Pentagon, were telling Bush, no, don't listen to the CIA. They're trying to distract you with this Osama bin Laden stuff in Afghanistan. We don't want to go to Afghanistan. That is taking our eyes off of the prize, which is Baghdad. That's what it's all about. We got to find a way to go to Iraq. And so this is one of the reasons that they didn't do their job for their first 8 months on the job, defending this country, supposedly being our security force, was because those who were concerned about bin Laden were told basically to be quiet because they were, getting in the way of the narrative. Then when the September 11th attack happens, it's way worse than anyone could have imagined. Thousands of people killed and the Pentagon hit and all of the rest of this stuff. Then they said, great, an excuse to go to Iraq. We'll just use this and we'll just figure out, we'll pretend that, it's them Arabs and Islamic extremists and so forth over there. You don't need to learn geography right now, but it's, some of them Arabs did it. And so we're going not just to Afghanistan, but we're going to Iraq too. And we're going soon enough for you to confuse the issue. And, the White House was careful the way they said this stuff. Dick Cheney outright lied and pretended to believe that Iraq was behind the attack. But none of the rest of the administration outright claimed that. But boy, do the neocons in the media claim it a million times over again. And by the time they invaded Iraq, 70%, a super duper majority of the American people believed that Saddam had done 9/11. Which, if that was true, why wouldn't we have started carpet bombing Baghdad immediately? It was obviously a hoax, and they knew it was a hoax, but they were happy for the American people to believe that. And that was their overriding agenda. And so why? Well, Bush wanted to prove that he was smarter and tougher than his father. And he wanted to get reelected so he could privatize Social Security in a second term, which luckily failed because of Hurricane Katrina. Just destroyed his credibility. Thank goodness for that. Can you imagine they had taken all of Social Security and put it in the stock market bubble that crashed in 2008? Remember that one? The worst bubble that ever crashed? Yeah. Anyway, Karl Rove wanted to start the war so he could make sure Bush was in the middle of a war so he could get him reelected in 2004. Dick Cheney wanted to do it because when he was the CEO of Halliburton in the 90s, he had helped run the company into the ground. He had bought a company called Dresser Industries just before they were held liable for literally billions of dollars worth of asbestos cancer claims. So he owed Halliburton, Kellogg Brown and Root a lot of money for screwing them over. And so this was his job, was to get them on the dole, building army bases and this kind of thing, collecting U.S. tax dollars. And then for the neoconservatives, essentially they are extremely close to the Likud party in Israel, and particularly the Benjamin Netanyahu's faction in Israel. And what they believed was that if they could get rid of Saddam Hussein, that would empower Jordan over Iraq. And then the Jordanians would tell the Shiite clergy in Iraq to tell the Lebanese Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran, and that would help Israel. And that was why the neoconservatives lied us into war. That was their idea of the primary strategy in the region. And of course, it did not work out that way at all. Instead, Iran's partisans ended up being the major beneficiaries of the war. And that's why, even as Bush succeeded in creating a new government in Baghdad, one which sits there to this day, they kicked us out in 2011, said, thanks for winning the war for us, now beat it, because they don't need us because they're friends with Iran next door. And so that whole thing was a complete disaster. But that was why they did it. Now in Afghanistan, essentially they just had to keep Afghanistan going so they could keep the war on terror, as they called it, going long enough to start the war in Iraq, which is going to take them a year and a half to build up all the forces in Kuwait for the invasion. And so they had to just keep the whole thing going. And that was immediately why they inflated bin Laden's group with the Taliban. And then for that matter, conflated bin Laden's group with Iraq and then the rest of it. Now, as far as staying there, essentially you have this conspiracy of interests, all of which are, none of which are good enough to stay there whatsoever. So yes, somebody's making money off that heroin, but it wasn't really the CIA selling drugs as, like back in the Vietnam days, as much as it was just all the people that the CIA was supporting in power were all selling drugs. And really all major warlord factions in Afghanistan are all in the heroin game. It's, something like, 40 to 60% of their entire GDP is based on poppies. And so all factions there are up to their eyeballs in it. And you could say, especially the factions backed by the United States. Hamid Karzai, who was the American puppet president there for 12 years or something, his half brother, Wali Karzai, was the biggest heroin dealer in Afghanistan. I saw Matthew Ho said that might make him the biggest heroin dealer in the world there for years until the Taliban finally killed him. And then, the State Department, they have something to prove. Look at us. We can remake a country. We're going to build a hydroelectric dam. We're going to build some girls' schools. And all these individual government employees, they get their tickets punched. They get their, promotion, but they end up not really achieving anything. And then same for, look at a fraud like General David Petraeus with his chest full of medals, even though all he did was lose 2 wars. And all those generals have their own so-called valor at stake, and they can't admit that they screwed up. They blew it. They bit off more than they could chew, and they lost. And so instead, they kept feeding guys into the meat grinder over there for, literally for 2 decades. Certainly for one extra entire decade after they knew they had lost the war.
Yeah, I'm curious about why Obama stayed there. I mean, what was the purpose for him?
They made him do it, and he was a coward, and so he rolled over for them. He knew better. And same for Donald Trump, by the way. Donald Trump should be congratulated, should really be thanked for pushing ahead with the peace deal to get us out. But in his first 2 years, he launched a massive escalation because the generals pressured him into it, and they rolled him the same way they did Obama. And you can read it in the New York Times right now. The story is how Biden defied the generals and their season-long pressure campaign to force him to stay, and he just refused. And it took everything President Biden had to face down his standing army. It's just like the founding fathers warned about. I mean, word for word of the dangers of a standing army, where just like any other bureaucracy, they want to find things to do so they don't have to get real jobs. If it's up to them, they'd stay forever.
That's just crazy stuff. Scott, when I hear the tapes regarding Vietnam with Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, I just get so angry. And when I think about what took place in Afghanistan and Iraq, I also get so angry because it's all about politics. We lose our young men and women because of gamesmanship and politics. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'll bring up your book again, enough already, the Time to End the War on Terror. Is it education, like with your book? How do we prevent this? I mean, it's been about 50 years since Vietnam, right? I mean, is there anything we can do? Is it an inevitable consequence of having a republic government like ours, or any of the others, I suppose? Is there anything that people can do to say, no, we aren't going to send our young men and women over for your next political endeavor, your exploit? What do we do?
Yes, and thank you for asking that. It's a great way to frame it. And the reality is, the American people, just like really anyone in the world, you get the government that you want. Ron Paul said, look, even in the Soviet Union, when people didn't believe in it anymore, in this totalitarian state, it just ceased to exist. It fell apart right in front of all of our eyes. And so if the American people decide we are supposed to have a limited constitutional republic, not a world empire. We're not supposed to be the global hegemon. If somebody wants to have a world empire, let the Europeans have their world empires. That's not our legacy. We're supposed to be the light of liberty, not the laser designator for satellite guided bombs on innocent people. And so if we live up to our highest ideals in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and Bill of Rights, then there's no room for a world empire whatsoever. The doctrine of global hegemony would have to be absolutely renounced. And we could be a normal country in a normal time. Simple as that.
Very,
and
very
it could
well
have been
said,
like
Scott.
that for the last 30 years, by the way. They didn't have to embark on this world empire after the fall of the Soviet Union. They could have abolished NATO, brought all the troops home, not cared at all whether Iraq invaded Kuwait, and stayed home. And it didn't have to be this way at all.
That would have been nice. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. I know that our viewers are going to be taking a look at your website, taking a look at your book. Really appreciate your insight on this. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you both so much for having me.